Welcome back to another deep dive. Before we even really get into the weeds of today's material, I just want to give you a quick reminder.
Right, the housekeeping stuff.
Exactly. If you find value in these detailed explorations that we do, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to the show. It genuinely helps us continue producing these extensive reviews for you.
And it guarantees you never miss out when we analyze these really significant cultural topics.
Yeah, and you are absolutely going to want to focus closely on today's discussion. We are doing a very thorough, unvarnished exploration of a highly provocative, fiercely debated new ebook that is making, well, just massive waves in the cultural discourse right now.
It certainly is generating a profound amount of discussion online. I mean, the text has sparked intense reactions across the board.
Oh, totally.
And it provides a highly detailed window into a very specific, very vocal cultural movement that is reshaping how a lot of people view modern society.
Right. So the book we are reviewing today is an ebook titled Spiritual Warfare Men Must Fight Principalities of Far-Left Satanism, authored by Conrad Riker.
Quite a title.
It really is. And if you find yourself intrigued by the concepts, the history, or the arguments we analyze in today's deep dive, and you want to read the source material directly for yourself, you should absolutely check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy the ebook.
You can also follow the author's ongoing essays and his digital campaigns on Substack at Conrad Riker, as well as on Twitter and YouTube.
We'll be sure to remind you about those platforms at the end of our discussion, too. But right now, we really need to set the stage here, because the mission of today's deep dive required some very, very specific context.
It's completely crucial to understand the target audience for this book and what the author is actively trying to achieve. I mean, Riker has written this text essentially as a manifesto and a comprehensive field manual.
Right, it's not just a casual read.
It's not. Not at all. It is directed toward a men's rights activist audience, specifically addressing men within what is often termed the red-pilled manosphere.
Yeah.
His stated goal is to provide these men with a sweeping historical and biological framework to understand how, in his view, foundational Western institutions were systematically captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
And right here is where I need to be absolutely crystal clear with you, the listener. Today's deep dive is going to impartially report on this politically charged content.
Yes, very important point.
We are not endorsing these viewpoints, we are not taking sides, and we are not validating the claims made in the text. Our role today is strictly to act as neutral guides.
We're just the messengers here.
Exactly. We are here to examine the raw, uncompromising, and incredibly intense worldview that Riker presents in this source material. Because regardless of where you might stand politically or socially, understanding the mechanics of this perspective is, well, it's vital for grasping the current cultural temperature.
And for understanding exactly why this specific rhetoric is resonating with so many thousands of men right now.
What stands out to me immediately is the sheer breadth of Riker's argument. He doesn't just rely on modern political talking points or standard culture war grievances.
No, he goes much deeper. Instead, he attempts to construct an entire alternate lens through which his readers should view human history, evolutionary biology, and even spirituality.
It's ambitious.
Very. If we connect this to the bigger picture, he is trying to offer a unified, grand theory to explain exactly why a certain demographic of men feel completely alienated, pathologized, and discarded in the modern world.
So how are we going to navigate this today? Our roadmap is pretty extensive. We'll begin by exploring Riker's foundational evolutionary arguments.
His core thesis about the biological battlefield.
Right, and primate behavior. From there, we will conduct a chapter-by-chapter dissection of what he calls institutional capture.
We'll analyze his arguments regarding family courts, the education system, media, the church, and his rather unexpected take on environmentalism.
Yeah, that part is wild. Finally, we'll deconstruct the arsenal he proposes. The actionable, real-world solutions he demands his readers adopt to rebuild what he calls classical masculinity.
And there is a tremendous amount of ground to cover.
So let's jump directly into the core thesis. Riker opens the book with the premise that there is quite literally a targeted war on masculinity.
Yes. He immediately sets the tone of existential conflict. He argues that the modern world is not just accidentally chaotic, nor is it merely going through, normal sociological growing pains.
Right.
In his framework, society is undergoing targeted biological and spiritual warfare, and he explicitly blames this on what he calls feminist Marxist cults.
Let's define that term for a moment, because Marxism is traditionally an economic framework, right? Regarding class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, how is Riker applying it here?
It is an important distinction to make. When Riker uses the term feminist Marxist or alludes to cultural Marxism, he's arguing that the traditional Marxist framework of economic class struggle has been deliberately transplanted onto cultural and gender issues.
Oh, okay.
In his view, instead of the working class rising against the wealthy, the new ideological goal is for marginalized identities.
Specifically organized feminism.
Exactly, specifically feminism, to rise against and dismantle traditional patriarchal Western norms. He views this not as an organic social movement, but as a deliberate strategy to destabilize society.
And he uses a very specific historical lens to justify this view of destabilization. He asserts that Western civilization itself is fundamentally a product of masculine logic.
Yes, he cites a statistic early on claiming that men built 98% of civilization's infrastructure.
He leans heavily on that concept, doesn't he?
Constantly, he continually contrasts this idea of architectural, structural, masculine logic against what he labels gynocentric emotionalism.
Gynocentric emotionalism.
Right. He paints a picture where logic is responsible for building aqueducts, drafting constitutions, and engineering bridges, while emotionalism,
Which he inextricably ties to modern progressive feminism.
yes, he claims it is focused entirely on feelings, safe spaces, and tearing those physical and conceptual structures down.
To back up this dichotomy between structure and chaos, he actually dives deep into evolutionary biology and primate politics.
This is where it gets fascinating.
He uses our closest primate relatives to explain modern human society. He specifically points to the observational research of primatologist Franz de Waal.
To contrast bonobos and chimpanzees.
Right, so unpack this evolutionary argument for us.
Well, he looks at bonobo societies, which are famously matriarchal. Riker characterizes their social structure based on de Waal's observations as chaotic, hypersexual, and inherently violent in a very specific way.
Violent how?
He argues that in bonobo troops, constant sexual coercion and social manipulation completely replace any kind of structured, predictable order.
He then immediately juxtaposes the bonobos with chimpanzee troops, right?
Precisely. He contrasts the matriarchal bonobos with chimpanzee troops, which are patriarchal and led by dominant males.
Okay.
He frames the chimpanzee model as being based on strict hierarchies, clear boundaries, and immediate physical consequences for breaking troop rules. For Riker, this isn't just an interesting nature documentary.
No, he treats it as a biological blueprint.
Exactly.
So he is extrapolating from primate behavior that modern society's current trajectory towards what institutions call equity and feminism is actually a biological devolution.
That is exactly his argument.
Yeah.
He's telling his readers that by dismantling patriarchal structures, we aren't evolving into a higher state of egalitarian enlightenment.
We're sliding backwards.
Sliding backward toward bonobo ethics, which he defines as chaotic, emotionally driven, and devoid of foundational order.
But how does he map that primate behavior onto actual human history? It seems like quite a leap to go from the jungle canopy straight to human civilization.
It's a massive leap, but it's totally foundational to his worldview. He bridges that gap using classical history.
Sparta.
Yes, leaning heavily on the example of ancient Sparta. He uses the Spartanagos.
Which was their state-sponsored, highly rigorous, and brutal military training program.
Right. He uses that as his ideal model of human development.
For context, the Goes was the system where Spartan boys were legally required to be taken from their mothers at the age of 7 to live in communal military barracks.
Correct. And Riker does not view that separation as a historical cruelty. He frames it as a strict biological necessity.
He argues that classical societies like Sparta intuit.
Wow.
And to cement that argument, he spends a significant portion of this first section aggressively attempting to dismantle what modern progressivism views as historical fact. He calls it feminist mythology.
Let's examine how he deconstructs that mythology. One of the primary narratives he attacks is the idea of the prehistoric matriarchal utopia.
Right, the popular historical concept that before patriarchal structures dominated the globe, ancient Neolithic societies were peaceful, goddess-worshipping, egalitarian communes without war or strict gender roles.
And he completely rejects that narrative.
He relies on recent archaeological re-examinations to argue that this utopia never existed. For instance, he cites a 2021 study from Cambridge University that re-examined Neolithic graves.
What did they find?
According to Riker's interpretation of this study, instead of finding evidence of a gender-fluid or matriarchal paradise, researchers found strict, indisputable gender divisions.
So the graves were separated by gender roles. Yes. Male skeletons were consistently buried with weapons of war and hunting, like stone axes and arrowheads, while female graves contained tools exclusively for domestic labor, like spindle whorls for weaving.
He also brings in data from evolutionary biologist Richard Wrangham to reinforce this. Wrangham's research essentially posits that if you look at the entire history of primates and early hominids, there is simply no biological precedent for a durable, long-lasting matriarchy.
Riker uses Wrangham's data to claim that nature simply does not support matriarchal dominance in the long run. He uses these ancient graves and biological timelines to deliver a very specific message to his readers.
Oh, it is.
He's effectively saying, look at the physical evidence in the ground. They're lying to you about the past to justify controlling your present.
And he applies that exact same aggressive skepticism to modern economic narratives. He transitions from ancient history to the modern workplace, heavily targeting the concept of the gender wage gap.
Oh, yes. He characterizes the gender wage gap not just as an exaggeration, but as a complete deception. He argues it is a myth born of behavioral choices rather than systemic patriarchal oppression.
To support this, he cites the research of Harvard economist Claudia Golden, who has extensively studied the gender earnings gap, as well as the work of author Warren Farrell.
The wage gap argument is clearly central to his thesis of institutional deception.
How exactly does he interpret the data to argue that the gap is a myth?
He points directly to statistics from the Department of Labor. He highlights data indicating that never married women under the age of 30 actually out-earn their male counterparts by roughly 8% in major metropolitan areas like New York City.
Meaning that the gap only appears later in life once marriage and children enter the equation.
Exactly. His argument is that the earnings gap only becomes significant in a worker's late 30s or 40s. He attributes this divergence not to corporate discrimination against women, but to men systematically choosing to work longer hours, taking less time off, and opting for significantly more dangerous jobs in order to support families.
Or, as he cynically adds, to pay for divorces.
Yes, that detail is very much in line with his tone.
He leans very heavily into the concept of dangerous jobs. He points out a staggering statistic that men suffer 92 to 93% of all workplace deaths.
This is where Warren Farrell's concept of the glass cellar comes into play, which Riker wholly adopts.
The glass cellar, let's explain that.
While society focuses on the glass ceiling keeping women out of boardrooms, Riker argues society ignores the glass cellar where men are dying in coal mines, on oil rigs, and in deep-sea welding operations.
He frames this 93% fatality rate as proof that men are the ones taking the ultimate physical risks that keep the electricity on and the water flowing.
He uses a very specific, deeply visceral analogy to drive this home. When he discusses progressive complaints about the wage gap, he compares it to arsonists complaining about the salaries of the firefighters who are actively putting out the flames.
Arsonists and firefighters. That is a highly deliberate rhetorical choice.
He is trying to elicit a sense of righteous indignation from his male readers. By comparing the critics to arsonists, he's telling his audience that their labor is not just unappreciated, but that the very people demanding equity are actively hostile to the men maintaining the civilization they live in.
That sense of deep indignation serves as the perfect transition into the next massive section of his book, once he feels he's established this biological and historical baseline.
That men built the world and are naturally hierarchical.
Right. He moves on to what he calls the capture of institutions. He goes chapter by chapter, diagnosing how this feminist Marxist alliance has allegedly infiltrated and hijacked the foundational pillars of Western society.
If the first section was about establishing the natural order, this section is about explaining how that order was subverted.
Let's start with perhaps his most fiery topic, one that clearly resonates deeply with his specific audience, the family courts. He titles this chapter The Fatherhood Holocaust.
We need to pause and acknowledge the gravity of that terminology.
Yeah, using a word like Holocaust to describe family court proceedings is intentionally incendiary.
It is designed to evoke images of systematic extermination. His core argument here is that the legal system, specifically family law and divorce court, has been utterly weaponized against men. He views it as a mechanism designed to financially liquidate men and legally sever them from their children.
He leans heavily on a specific statistic from the U.S. Census Bureau to prove this systemic bias. He states that 83.4% of sole custody cases are awarded to mothers.
For Riker, that 83.4% is not a reflection of who served as the primary caregiver during the marriage, nor is it a reflection of amicable settlements.
No.
He interprets that massive statistical disparity as undeniable evidence of a systemic gynocentric bias programmed directly into the judiciary.
To bring this statistical grievance to life, he shares an incredibly detailed anecdote about a man he refers to as Mike.
Mike the Detroit welder.
Right? Mike is described as a blue-collar welder living in Detroit. He is pulling 60-hour work weeks, taking on grueling physical labor just to provide for his family. And then, a divorce is initiated.
According to Riker's account, the judge not only awards full sole custody of the children to Mike's ex-wife, but the court also attaches Mike's mandatory overtime pay to his alimony and child support obligations.
And the detail he includes next is what makes the anecdote so potent for his readers. He claims the ex-wife used that legally extracted overtime pay to fund her startup business.
Which was a holistic dog bakery.
A holistic dog bakery.
It is the perfect anecdotal distillation of his overarching grievance. Whether the story is perfectly accurate or an amalgamation of cases, it serves a precise narrative function.
It sets up the contrast perfectly for his argument.
Exactly. He presents the man as the essential physical laborer,
The welder building infrastructure.
who is being legally extorted by the state to fund what he views as a frivolous, modern, feminine indulgence, the holistic dog bakery. It contrasts essential male utility with perceived female frivolity, enforced by the power of the state.
He follows up this anecdote by referencing a chilling piece of terminology allegedly used by Goldman Sachs analysts. He claims that in financial models, modern divorce is coldly referred to as male liquidation events.
Male liquidation events. It reduces the dissolution of a family and the stripping of a man's assets to a clinical corporate transaction.
He points out that an estimated $28 billion flows annually from husbands to divorce lawyers and ex-spouses.
He uses this $28 billion figure to argue that the introduction of California's no-fault divorce laws in the 1970s did not liberate people from abusive marriages.
Rather, it created a massive cottage industry. In his view, marriages are now dissolved for profit, and children are actively weaponized as leverage to extract wealth from productive men.
If the courts are the mechanism for extracting male resources, Riker views the education system as the mechanism for ensuring men are too ideologically subdued to fight back.
Moving from the courthouse to the classroom, he turns his attention to what he refers to as educational indoctrination camps.
His primary critique here is that public schools and universities have entirely abandoned the pursuit of objective merit, academic excellence, and logic in favor of enforcing obedience and social equity.
He argues that the education system no longer teaches students how to think, but what to think.
And that the curriculum is specifically designed to penalize traditional male learning styles, which he characterizes as competitive, physically active, and focused on objective truth.
He provides a rather shocking example from the Chicago public school system to illustrate this shift away from objective truth. He claims there was an educational initiative pushing the concept that 2 + 2 = 5 could be considered an acceptable answer in certain contexts for the sake of fairness.
Or to avoid marginalizing learning styles that struggle with rigid mathematical absolutes. This is a direct reference to debates around ethnomathematics and equitable grading, but Riker distills it to its most absurd extreme to make his point.
Natural.
He uses the 2 + 2 = 5 example as proof that subjective emotionalism is actively replacing objective reality in the classroom. He claims his own nephew was pulled out of the public school system the very same day that concept was introduced.
And he contrasts that public school failure with classical homeschooling. He probably notes that by age 10, this homeschooled nephew was reading the works of the Roman statesman Cicero.
Meanwhile, he points to standardized testing data showing massive systemic reading failures across major public school districts,
What he is highlighting is a perceived shift from classical pedagogy
which historically focused on grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
to ideological conformity. But he doesn't just focus on how subjects are taught. He focuses heavily on historical erasure within the curriculum.
He is deeply critical of initiatives like the 1619 Project, which recenters the American narrative around the consequences of slavery.
He views this 1619 project not as a necessary historical correction, but as deliberate historical illiteracy designed specifically to demonize Western male achievement and justify the dismantling of meritocracy.
He contrasts the project's assertions with the work of preeminent historians like Princeton's Gordon Wood.
Who has been highly critical of the 1619 Project's historical accuracy regarding the motivations for the American Revolution.
Right. Riker uses Wood's academic critique to tell his readers that the public school curriculum is based on ideological lies rather than historical fact.
And it's not just what is being taught, it's who is being explicitly censored on college campuses. Riker expresses intense frustration that modern universities will assign readings like Valerie Solanas' SUM manifesto.
For listeners who might be unfamiliar, SUM literally stands for the Society for Cutting Up Men. It is a radical feminist tract written in the late 1960s that, quite literally, advocates for the elimination of the male sex.
Riker is furious that a text advocating for male extinction is treated as valid, assignable academic theory in sociology and gender studies courses.
Yet at the exact same time, thinkers like Jordan Peterson, who rely on evolutionary biology and Jungian psychology to discuss biological realities, are protested, censored, deplatformed, or fired by those same universities.
He sees this double standard as proof that universities are no longer halls of free inquiry, but rather re-education gulags. If a text threatens men, it is academic theory, but if a text defends traditional male structures, it is dangerous hate speech.
This alleged ideological control extends seamlessly into his analysis of media and big tech.
A chapter he labels mind poisoning. How does he connect the censorship on college campuses to the algorithms of Silicon Valley?
Riker posits that big tech companies act as the unaccountable thought police for cultural Marxism. He argues that they use opaque algorithms to actively suppress political dissent, control the cultural narrative, and digitally quarantine anyone advocating for classical masculinity.
He backs up this accusation by citing leaked internal Facebook memos from 2021. According to his interpretation of these memos, Facebook's algorithms were allegedly tweaked by engineers to shadow ban conservative content 400% more often than liberal or progressive posts.
A shadow ban, for those unaware, is when a platform algorithmically restricts the reach of your content without notifying you, making you essentially invisible to the broader network.
Riker also points his focus toward YouTube. He describes a pervasive double standard where YouTube will swiftly demonetize or remove videos that discuss traditional biblical masculinity, citing hate speech guidelines.
Yet simultaneously, he claims the platform allows content that promotes literal satanic imagery or extreme radical ideologies to remain monetized and highly recommended by the algorithm.
He argues this is not a series of innocent algorithmic glitches or standard corporate moderation.
He'd use it as a deliberate, coordinated strategy of psychological demoralization. It is ideological warfare waged through code.
But Riker is surprisingly pragmatic here. He doesn't just complain about the algorithms, he demands action. He advises his readers that complaining about Twitter or YouTube is useless.
Instead, he actively encourages his audience to migrate to and financially support alternative platforms like Gab or Rumble.
He argues that the only true defense against big tech censorship is building parallel structures. He wants his readers to become uncancelable by building independent digital economies, separate payment processors, and separate server hosts.
Let's pivot to one of the most surprising chapters in this entire section, his critique of the church. Given the frequent overlap between the manosphere and traditional conservatism, you might expect a book like this to universally praise religion as a bastion against modernity.
But Riker is actually deeply aggressively critical of modern Christianity.
Yes, he believes the modern church has committed a fatal compromise. He argues that Christianity has been completely stripped of its historical, masculine, militant authority.
In his view, it has traded its role as a spiritual fortress and a moral arbiter for the soft, non-judgmental aesthetics of a modern therapy session.
To illustrate this perceived spiritual decay, he draws a stark, almost unbelievable contrast between two very different approaches to spiritual warfare, specifically looking at the Catholic rite of exorcism.
The contrast he presents is highly illustrative of his broader point about authority versus empathy. First, he describes what he refers to as an affirming, progressive diocese located in Chicago.
He claims that when modern exorcists there confronted a suspected demonic possession, they actually began the rite by asking the demonic entity for its preferred pronouns.
And according to Riker's account, the result of extending progressive empathy to a literal demon was that the entity began making absurd, modern demands.
He claims the entity demanded gluten-free communion wafers and requested the presence of a therapy dog during the exorcism.
It sounds like dark comedy, but he uses this alleged incident to show how fundamentally ridiculous he believes things have gotten.
His point is that by prioritizing inclusive empathy over divine authority, the modern church is literally negotiating with evil instead of casting it out.
He directly juxtaposes that incredibly soft therapeutic approach with what he calls the Polish model of exorcism.
Huh.
In Eastern Europe, he argues, the church has retained an unapologetic traditional masculine order.
Right.
How does that Polish model operate in his view?
He describes exorcists in Poland who do not negotiate, who do not ask for pronouns, and who do not offer therapy dogs.
Instead, they bark commands in Latin, utilizing strict hierarchical authority to demand that the demons kneel before the real presence of the sacrament.
He is using this theological extreme to make a much broader cultural point.
He is stating that casting out darkness, whether you interpret that as literal demons or the metaphorical darkness of cultural Marxism, requires unyielding, masculine authority. It cannot be achieved through soft, inclusive empathy.
And to drive the nail into the coffin of his critique of the modern church, he mentions a specific incident at a Catholic cathedral in Stockholm, Sweden.
He notes that they apparently held a feminist Friday Mass.
For Riker, this isn't just a quirky, misguided attempt by a parish to get younger, progressive people back into the pews. He views it as absolute, undeniable evidence of terminal spiritual decay.
He states unequivocally that you cannot worship God and worship feminist ideologies simultaneously. You must choose which master you serve.
This brings us to what might be his most creative, and certainly his most unorthodox interpretation of institutional capture.
His views on environmentalism.
Exactly. Riker does not view the Green Movement as a genuine, scientifically motivated effort to save the planet. He frames it entirely as state-sponsored cuckoldry.
The terminology alone, state-sponsored cuckoldry, is designed to be maximally provocative and offensive to mainstream sensibilities. But we must analyze how he connects the dots between environmental policy and the emasculation of men.
How exactly does he make that connection?
He argues that climate hysteria is deliberately weaponized to legally restrict the freedom and extract the wealth of productive blue-collar men, while simultaneously rewarding the moral vanity of coastal elites.
He uses the economic system of cap-and-trade carbon credits as his primary example.
Yes. In Riker's framework, carbon credits are functionally no different from medieval Catholic indulgences.
He argues that female-dominated progressive NGOs sell carbon forgiveness to wealthy corporations and rich liberals. This allows the elite to feel morally superior and continue flying on private jets, while the actual economic burden,
The increased cost of energy, the loss of manufacturing jobs, the regulations on farming,
is shifted entirely onto the shoulders of working-class men.
he sees it as a system where baited taxpayers are forced to subsidize the luxury status symbols of the elite, all operating under the unassailable guise of reducing carbon footprints.
And he gets incredibly specific with wildlife conservation policies, too. He brings up the controversial elephant hunting ban in Botswana.
This is a classic example of his analytical style. Conventionally, if you tell the public that a government banned the hunting of elephants, the immediate emotional response is positive.
The assumption is that banning hunting saves the elephants.
But Riker points out the hidden, on-the-ground economics that the emotional response ignores. He notes that when the hunting ban went into effect, the poaching of elephants actually tripled in the region.
He explains the mechanics behind this counterintuitive result. Prior to the ban, legitimate, permitted big game hunters were paying upwards of $500,000 in safari and tag fees.
That massive influx of capital was directly funding the armed anti-poaching rangers and the habitat conservation efforts.
So when the Western NGOs successfully lobbied to ban the hunters, the funding completely vanished.
The rangers lost their jobs, and the heavily armed illegal poachers had free rein to slaughter the herds without opposition.
Riker views this outcome through a strictly gendered lens. He frames the ban as the triumph of feminine emotionalism
Feeling sad for the elephants and demanding a ban.
over masculine logic, which would be using the cold, hard economics of regulated hunting to fund actual physical habitat protection.
He argues that keyboard conservationists in Western capitals prioritize their own moral vanity over ecological reality.
He brings this argument closer to home by discussing federal wilderness designations in the United States.
He claims that these environmental designations are actively used to block millions of acres of public land from traditional hunters and outdoorsmen.
To ground this, he shares a story about an Apache friend of his whose ancestral hunting grounds in Utah were suddenly seized and cordoned off by a federal monument designation, pushed through by environmental lobbyists.
Riker states that these lands, which indigenous and local hunters had responsibly maintained for centuries, are now paved over and turned into what he calls tourist toilets for urban Instagram influencers to trample over for selfies.
He views hunting not merely as a recreational sport, but as a vital biological expression of ancestral male sovereignty. a connection to the earth and to the provision of meat that the modern bureaucratic state is actively trying to regulate out of existence.
Let's synthesize this massive section on institutional capture. If we look at the family courts, the public schools, the algorithms of big tech, the liturgy of the church, and the policies of environmental NGOs, what is his overarching conclusion?
Riker's unified thesis is that across every single one of these seemingly disparate institutions, the overarching goal of the ruling ideology is identical: to restrict male freedom, to legally extract male resources, and to penalize, pathologize, or outright ban traditional male behaviors.
That synthesis leads us directly into Section 3 of the book: biological reality, medical misandry, and the sexual marketplace.
This is where Riker takes all those systemic institutional arguments and makes them deeply personal, psychological, and biological for his reader.
Let's start with the sexual marketplace, because to understand the manosphere's worldview, we have to understand their reliance on the concept of hypergamy.
We need to define hypergamy clearly, as it is the bedrock of his perspective on relationships. Hypergamy is a concept originating in evolutionary psychology.
It refers to the observed tendency, primarily in females across various species, including humans, to selectively seek mates who possess higher socioeconomic status, greater physical dominance, or perceived superior genetic quality compared to themselves.
Riker leans heavily on prominent evolutionary psychologists like David Buss and Roy Baumeister to validate this.
Yes, he uses their research to argue that female deception, whether it occurs in the dating phase, during a marriage, or while testifying in family court, is not a modern anomaly or a moral failing.
Rather, it's a deeply hardwired evolutionary survival strategy designed to extract the best possible resources for offspring.
He treats the modern dating world like a mathematically rigged casino, and he uses massive data sets from dating apps to attempt to prove his point.
This data is often cited in these circles because it provides empirical backing to feelings of romantic rejection.
Riker pulls data from the dating platform OkCupid, which analyzed how its users rated the opposite sex.
The data showed that women, on average, rated 80% of the men on the platform as below average in physical attractiveness.
Which, mathematically speaking, is impossible. You cannot have 80% of the given population reside below the statistical median. It shows a profoundly skewed perception of average.
He pairs that skewed perception with a study from MIT analyzing interactions on dating platforms. That study indicated that roughly 90% of all female attention and messaging on these apps targets only the top 10% of men, the men who represent the apex of physical and financial status.
Does he address the criticism that using dating app data might just reflect the superficial design of the apps themselves, rather than revealing deeply hardwired human evolutionary traits?
He dismisses that criticism completely. For Riker, the apps simply removed the social friction and revealed the raw, underlying biological imperative.
He uses this data to directly validate the profound feelings of alienation that many average working-class men experience today. He's essentially telling his reader, you are not crazy, you are not inherently defective, the game is mathematically and biologically rigged against you.
He posits that this hypergamous instinct, when it is unleashed by modern feminist liberation and no longer restrained by the social expectations of traditional lifelong marriage contracts, turns society into a brutal winner-take-all arena.
In this arena, the vast majority of men, the men building the infrastructure, are deemed completely invisible or entirely disposable.
And that profound sense of male disposability bleeds directly into his incredibly dark views on the medical establishment.
Riker claims there is pervasive medical misandry, driving what he identifies as a literal male suicide crisis.
We need to pause here because this is an incredibly heavy, sensitive subject, and we must analyze how Riker approaches it. He argues that the medical field, working in tandem with the education system, actively pathologizes normal boyhood behavior.
The primary evidence he offers to support this claim is the disparity in diagnosis rates for behavioral disorders, specifically ADHD. He points to medical statistics showing that young boys are diagnosed with ADHD at nearly 3 times the rate of young girls.
How does he interpret that disparity? He doesn't believe it's just a biological difference in neurological development.
No, he interprets it as an institutional intolerance for masculine energy. He believes that female-dominated school environments and modern pediatricians actively medicate young boys into a state of docile compliance.
He argues that traditional masculine traits, high physical energy, baseline aggression, competitiveness, and risk-taking, are no longer viewed as necessary traits for future protectors.
Instead, they are treated as medical defects that must be chemically suppressed with amphetamines.
The ultimate outcome of all this pathologizing, alienation, and chemical suppression, according to Riker, is the male suicide rate. And the statistics he cites here are universally recognized as a crisis.
Men die by suicide at a rate 3.5 times higher than women.
He cites a terrifying metric to conceptualize this. A man in the Western world takes his own life every 14 minutes.
But we must examine Riker's specific rhetoric regarding this tragedy. He vehemently refuses to call this a statistic or a mental health crisis. He labels it an extermination.
That is a severe accusation. He is implying intentionality behind the suicide rate.
He believes the systemic extraction of male resources through the family courts, combined with the societal messaging that masculinity is toxic, actively drives men to despair.
And he argues that society monetizes their destruction during the divorce process and then completely ignores the resulting fatalities because male lives are viewed as disposable.
He extends this accusation of systemic medical misandry to literal life and death triage decisions. He brings up a very controversial, deeply unsettling claim regarding the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic.
He focuses specifically on the crisis in Italy's Lombardy region, which was overwhelmed early in the pandemic. According to Riker's account, when ventilators and ICU beds ran desperately short, medical bioethicists allegedly made systemic triage decisions that prioritized women for life-saving treatment.
Utilizing the justification that women were the primary caregivers for children.
He claims this specific triage policy resulted in an 82% higher male mortality rate in that region compared to female mortality.
For Riker, whether that disparity was entirely due to triage policies or also involved biological vulnerabilities to the virus, he uses the narrative to prove his ultimate point.
That when resources become scarce, the institutional systems view male lives as fundamentally disposable and secondary to female survival.
It is an incredibly bleak, dark worldview. But he argues that this assault on men isn't just psychological, legal, or institutional. He believes it is literally biochemical.
He devotes an entire chapter to what he calls physical disintegration and chemical warfare.
He claims that the observed physical softening and weakening of modern men is not an accident of modern convenience, but a deliberate, engineered project.
He points to the well-documented precipitous drop in male testosterone levels across the Western world. Studies show that average testosterone levels in men have been declining by roughly 1% annually since 1982.
A 30-year-old man today has significantly less testosterone than his grandfather did at the same age.
While mainstream endocrinologists and medical researchers debate the complex causes of this decline, pointing to rising obesity rates, sedentary office lifestyles, and poor sleep, Riker attributes it to a targeted chemical attack by the state and corporate entities.
He specifically targets the modern food supply and the proliferation of plastics. He cites a UCLA study regarding the composition of USDA public school lunches.
He claims that the institutional push for cheaper, plant-based diets deliberately replaced high-quality animal proteins with highly processed, estrogenic soy products.
He argues this dietary shift directly leads to lower free testosterone and delayed physical maturation in adolescent boys within the public school system.
He also points to the crisis of microplastics and endocrine disruptors. Let's explain that briefly. Endocrine disruptors are chemicals found in many modern plastics and pesticides that can mimic or interfere with the body's natural hormones, like estrogen and testosterone.
Riker highlights that these chemicals are now flooding the municipal water supplies and food packaging. In his political framework, this is not just corporate negligence, it is a feature of the system.
He posits that weak, low testosterone men lack the physical drive and aggression required to rebel against tyranny. Therefore, he argues, chemically castrating the male population serves the ultimate goals of cultural Marxism by creating a compliant, docile populace.
He captures this concept of physical and civilizational decline beautifully, if tragically, through a very specific artistic metaphor. He contrasts two pieces of public sculpture. First, he examines Michelangelo's iconic statue of David.
He notes that David stands in a classic contrapposto pose, which is an asymmetrical posture where the figure's weight is shifted onto one leg.
It places roughly 60% of the marble's weight on one leg, embodying a sense of tensile strength, coiled readiness for battle against Goliath, and the absolute pinnacle of classical idealized male beauty and physical capability.
Exactly. David represents the idealized male form prepared for necessary violence to defend his people. Riker directly contrasts David with a 1976 piece of public sculpture located in Philadelphia called Clothespin, created by Claes Oldenburg.
How does he interpret a giant sculpture of a clothespin?
He characterizes the clothespin as a bulbous, abstract, industrial form. In his interpretation, the shape resembles a massive, dominant female figure physically crushing a tiny, rigid man beneath her central spring.
For Riker, this shift in public art, moving from the celebration of robust, heroic masculinity during the Renaissance to the celebration of abstraction, industrial utility, and perceived female dominance in the modern era, perfectly mirrors the civilizational decay he has been documenting throughout the book.
We have waded through an absolutely massive amount of heavy, deeply dark analysis.
Riker has painted a comprehensive picture of a world where men are actively under attack in the divorce courts, marginalized in the schools, alienated by the churches, mathematically discarded in the dating market, and poisoned at a cellular level.
It is a narrative of total siege, but importantly for his readers, he does not conclude the book on a note of despair. Section 4 is titled The Arsenal, and it is entirely focused on actionable solutions for rebuilding what he calls victorious manhood.
So after diagnosing all of this systemic rot, how does Riker propose a man actually fights back against what he terms the principalities of far-left Satanism?
He argues that it must begin with intellectual and spiritual armoring. Riker demands that his readers aggressively upgrade their mental operating systems before they take any physical action. To do this, he advocates for a complete return to classical pedagogy, specifically mastering the trivium.
The trivium. That is the foundational educational model of classical antiquity and the Middle Ages. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric. How does he apply those to the modern culture war?
He treats them as intellectual weapons. He argues that men must first master grammar to expose the manipulative word games of the progressive left. He points to things like compelled pronoun usage, or the academic redefinition of foundational terms like racism, violence, or woman.
By mastering grammar, a man refuses to concede the premise of the opponent's language.
Once grammar is secured, he moves to logic.
Yes, he demands his readers study Aristotelian logic to systematically demolish what he views as emotionally manipulative, false, feminist arguments. He wants them to identify logical fallacies instantly.
Finally, they must master rhetoric to persuasively and aggressively reclaim the concepts of Western virtue and classical masculinity in the public square.
To fortify this intellectual training, he relies heavily on Stoic philosophy. He references the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius and his book Meditations constantly throughout this section.
But he makes a very specific point regarding Aurelius. He notes that Aurelius did not write meditations in the comfort of a modern university safe space. He wrote those philosophical treatises while commanding legions in a war camp on the Germanic frontier, forging his philosophy in literal blood and mud.
He also leans on the 19th century philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is notoriously pessimistic and held deeply cynical views on human nature, and particularly harsh views on women.
Riker utilizes Schopenhauer to provide his readers with a defensive, highly cynical framework regarding female nature and hypergamy, aiming to make his readers emotionally bulletproof against romantic rejection or manipulation.
And he marries all of this classical Stoic philosophy with what can only be described as muscular Christianity. As the title of the book implies, he views the culture war not as a political disagreement, but as actual, literal spiritual warfare.
He draws deeply on the biblical passage of Ephesians 6, the exhortation to put on the full armor of God. But he does not treat this as a quaint Sunday school metaphor. He treats it as a literal field manual for surviving demonic ideologies.
Furthermore, he invokes the theological principles of just war, developed by Thomas Aquinas, to morally justify an aggressive, unyielding, and combative stance against modern cultural trends.
He is explicitly telling his readers that they are not just victims of a bad system, they are holy warriors called to fight in a degraded, fallen age.
But the armoring he proposes isn't just in the mind or the spirit, it has to be intensely physical. To break the conditioning of big tech, Riker demands his readers undertake a massive digital detox.
He specifically references the Iron Mind Protocol, a concept popularized by the highly controversial influencer Andrew Tate. The protocol mandates a strict 72 hours with absolute zero access to social media, algorithms, or digital pornography.
Riker claims that his own independent testing of this protocol among his private groups resulted in a massive spike in baseline focus and an astonishing 18% increase in serum testosterone levels among the participants.
He tells his readers that their prefrontal cortex is the last unconquered territory, and they have to forcefully log off to defend it from algorithmic colonization.
Which transitions seamlessly into his rigorous demands for physical reclamation. His primary mantra for this section is brilliant in its concise rhetorical framing: deadlifts, not DEI statements.
Deadlifts, not DEI statement. Let's examine that slogan. It deliberately contrasts the grueling, objective physical exertion of lifting heavy iron against the subjective corporate compliance of signing a diversity, equity, and inclusion pledge.
Exactly. He argues that engaging in heavy resistance training, consuming a strictly meat-based diet, and subjecting the body to extreme physical stress like sunrise ice baths are not simply internet health fads.
In Riker's framework, these are visceral acts of political defiance. He believes that building physical strength repairs the dopamine receptors in the brain, flushes out endocrine disruptors, and ultimately restores a man's biological imperative to master his own destiny rather than submitting to the state.
The final piece of his strategic solution is perhaps the most radical aspect of the entire book. He calls for community rebuilding and parallel structures. Riker essentially believes that existing state institutions, the courts, the schools, the corporate HR departments, are entirely beyond saving or reforming.
Because he believes they are beyond reform, he demands that men must actively secede from them.
The most prominent example he gives of this secession is the institution of marriage. He explicitly, forcefully tells his readers to absolutely reject state-sanctioned marriage contracts.
Remember, he previously defined state marriage as an engineered male liquidation event. He views signing a marriage license as voluntarily handing a loaded gun to the family court system. Instead, he advocates for the creation of what he terms virtue contracts.
What exactly is a virtue contract?
These are essentially private, extra-legal, legally binding agreements forged entirely outside the family court system, often arbitrated within underground, private male networks. Riker claims these networks already exist and possess thousands of active members.
And these contracts are designed with incredibly draconian penalties to enforce traditional behavior, correct?
Yes. They include strict biological and financial penalties. For instance, he outlines clauses that stipulate automatic total asset forfeiture if infidelity by either party can be proven before a private arbitrator.
The goal is to completely bypass the no-fault, feminist-controlled family courts and enforce severe consequences for breaking the vows.
He shares a wild story to validate this approach. He details the case of a surgeon who was allegedly cuckolded by his partner. But because the surgeon had utilized one of these private virtue contracts instead of a standard state marriage license, he was able to legally bypass the family courts and seamlessly reclaim his Porsche, his home, and his medical practice overnight without paying a dime in alimony.
Riker refers to this system of private agreements and absolute accountability as the Spartan social contract. It is the ultimate weaponized expression of the MGTOW philosophy.
Let's define MGTOW for the listener. It stands for men going their own way. It is a subculture within the manosphere that advocates for men to completely separate themselves from women, and a society they believe has been irreversibly corrupted by feminism, prioritizing male sovereignty above all else.
Riker takes the MGTOW concept of separation and attempts to organize it into a shadow civilization. He urges men to aggressively build male-only physical spaces, to pool their financial resources into shared, massive legal defense funds, and to rely entirely on classical, localized homeschooling networks rather than subjecting their children to state education.
He highlights a specific men's group operating in Detroit as a proof of concept. He claims this localized brotherhood successfully slashed its members' divorce and ruin rates by 90%, simply by utilizing shared legal resources to intimidate opposing counsel, and by strictly enforcing virtue-based accountability and stoicism among the men in the group.
He is not just suggesting a lifestyle tweak, he is literally proposing the architectural construction of a parallel patriarchal civilization operating beneath the surface of the modern state.
We have covered an immense, almost overwhelming amount of ground today. From the behavioral observations of bonobo monkeys to the liturgy of the Catholic Church, from the financial devastation of divorce courts to the biological defiance of deadlifts.
Let's synthesize exactly what we have just spent the last hour exploring. Riker's book, Spiritual Warfare Men Must Fight Principalities of Far-Left Satanism, is an incredibly intense, unyielding, and deeply polarizing text.
Uncompromising is the most accurate word for it. The book functions as a comprehensive, no-holds-barred field manual tailored for a very specific, growing demographic. Men who feel fundamentally abandoned, medically pathologized, and legally betrayed by the foundational institutions of the modern West.
It provides them with a highly structured vocabulary to articulate their rage, does it not?
Yes. It offers them a sweeping historical and biological framework that casts their personal struggles not as individual failures, but as evidence that they are the targeted victims of a massive civilizational conspiracy. It transforms their alienation into a holy war.
And whether you view this book as a desperately necessary wake-up call to save Western civilization, or as a highly dangerous piece of radicalizing propaganda based on skewed data, we want to leave you, the listener, with a provocative thought to mull over.
Regardless of whether you agree with Riker's interpretations of evolutionary biology, his aggressive political stances, or his intense hostility toward modern feminism, the undeniable deep resonance of this text among tens of thousands of men points to a profound, undeniable crisis.
There is a massive crisis of meaning and a desperate lack of belonging in modern masculinity.
That is the ultimate takeaway. If the traditional institutions that guided previous generations, the public schools, the legal courts, the mainstream churches, the traditional corporate ladder, are genuinely no longer providing a viable, respected framework for male purpose, identity, and dignity, a massive vacuum is created in the culture.
The vital question we must ask ourselves is, what is going to fill that vacuum in the coming decades? Will it be the parallel, aggressive Spartan brotherhoods that Riker proposes, or will society formulate something entirely different to integrate these men back into the fold?
It is a question that is absolutely going to define the political and social trajectory of the next generation of our culture.
Well, that wraps up our incredibly extensive deep dive for today. Remember, if you found this in-depth conversation and analysis valuable, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you these deep dives.
And if you want to brave the source material yourself and see exactly how Riker constructs these arguments, go purchase the ebook, Spiritual Warfare Men Must Fight Principalities of Far-Left Satanism by Conrad Riker.
You can find it available right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. And be sure to follow the author's ongoing digital warfare and essays over at Conrad Riker on Substack, as well as on Twitter and YouTube. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you on the next deep dive.